It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Isabelle Grace Hartwell laughed as she poured the expensive vintage champagne over Catherine Marie Hartwell's dress in front of the entire morning party. The pale gold liquid soaked into the shoulder of Catherine's black silk dress, a cold, sticky weight that mirrored the numbness in her chest. Grandma Aliner had been in the ground for less than 2 hours, and the vultures were already circling the buffet at the Hartwell manor. "Oh, Catherine, I am so sorry," Isabelle said, her voice carrying across the mahogany-paneled drawing room. She didn't sound sorry, she sounded delighted. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, the ones she'd worn throughout the graveside service to hide the fact that she hadn't shed a single tear. "I suppose I'm just a bit shaky. It's been such a traumatic day for those of us who actually had a deep emotional connection with Grandma." Catherine didn't flinch. She felt the eyes of the Hartwell board members and the extended family pressing into her like physical weights. She could smell the cloying, funeral home scent of lilies competing with the sharp, yeasty aroma of the spilled wine. She reached for a linen napkin from a passing server's tray, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's fine, Isabelle," she said, her voice a calm, low contrast to her sister's performative grief. "Is it?" Mr. Hartwell stepped forward, his face etched with a practiced solemnity that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't look at the stain on Catherine's dress. He looked at the crystal flute in Isabelle's hand, his expression softening as it always did for his younger daughter. "You really should be more careful where you stand, Catherine. You're making a scene at your grandmother's wake. It's disrespectful to her memory to be so unkempt." Mrs. Hartwell nodded in agreement, smoothing the front of her pristine Chanel suit. "Honestly, Catherine, you've always been so clumsy when you're under pressure. Maybe you should go upstairs and change into something less conspicuous. You're dampening the mood for the guests who came to celebrate Aliner's legacy." The injustice of it was a physical spark in Catherine's throat, but she swallowed it down. For 10 years, she had been the one running Hartwell operations as the director. She was the one who had stayed late to fix the supply chain issues, while Isabelle was in Chalum, finding her brand. She was the one who had held Grandma Aliner's hand in the hospital every night for a month, while the rest of them were in the study arguing over who got the summer house in the Hamptons. "I'll be fine," Catherine said, her gaze shifting to the far corner of the room. Richard Morrison stood there, leaning against a heavy oak bookshelf. The family's longtime attorney looked like a man holding a very expensive, very dangerous secret. He caught Catherine's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He held a leather-bound folder tucked under his arm, the final will and testament of Aliner Hartwell. "I hope you aren't expecting much from the reading, Catherine," Isabelle whispered, leaning in so close that the scent of her expensive, floral perfume was suffocating. "Dad already told me that since I'm the one who actually brings value to the family brand with my social presence, I'll be taking over the operations director chair. You can go back to being a glorified secretary. It's more your speed." Isabelle's designer heels clicked aggressively on the parquet floor as she turned to greet a group of investors. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. James Hartwell, a second cousin from the accounting department, drifted toward Catherine. He lowered his voice, his eyes darting toward their parents who were busy charming a local senator. "She's been in the study all morning, Catherine. She and your dad were trying to find the safe codes before the funeral." Sarah Chen caught them on the security feed in the main office, too. "They're trying to move the private equity shares before Richard opens that folder." Catherine felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. She reached into her small clutch and felt the jagged edge of a USB drive Sarah had slipped her earlier that morning. It contained every minute of that footage, the desperate, greedy fumbling of a family that thought they were untouchable. "Let them try," Catherine murmured. "You're too quiet," James whispered, looking worried. "They think they've already won. Isabelle's already posted a story about her new executive role to her 500,000 followers. She's acting like the queen of the manor." "Arrogance is a heavy veil, James," Catherine said. She looked at her sister, who was currently posing for a selfie in front of a portrait of the woman they had just buried. Isabelle looked radiant, entitled, and entirely oblivious to the storm brewing in the lawyer's folder. Catherine thought about the 35% stake she had earned through a decade of sweat, missed holidays, and silent sacrifices. She thought about the codicil Grandma Aliner had signed only 3 days ago, witnessed by Richard and Sarah. "Catherine," Mrs. Hartwell called out, waving her over with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Stop whispering with the staff and come help Isabelle pick out which of Aliner's emerald brooches she should wear for the press photos tomorrow. We need to look like a united front for the leadership transition." Catherine took a breath, the scent of the spilled champagne now a bitter reminder of the war that had just begun. She looked at Richard Morrison, who was finally stepping toward the center of the room, clearing his throat to command the attention of every person in the house. "In a moment, Mother," Catherine said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I think Mr. Morrison has something more important for us to discuss first." She didn't look like a woman who had just been humiliated. As the lawyer unbuckled the leather strap of his folder, Catherine straightened her shoulders. She was counting down the seconds until the cage door opened, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to be the one trapped inside. That evening, the air in the Hartwell drawing room was thick with the scent of spilled vintage Bollinger and the metallic tang of impending disaster. Catherine Marie Hartwell stood perfectly still, the damp silk of her dress clinging to her ribs like a cold, mocking second skin. Across the room, Isabelle Grace Hartwell was already scrolling through her phone, her thumb clicking rhythmically against the screen as she adjusted her lighting for a selfie. "Honestly, Richard, can we hurry this up?" Isabelle said, not looking up from her screen. "I have a dinner reservation at 8, and Catherine is starting to smell like a cheap bar. It's embarrassing for the staff to see her like this." Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. "Isabelle is right, Richard. Let's settle the formalities. Aliner's wishes were always clear. The legacy belongs to those who can maintain the family's image. Catherine, dear, perhaps you should go change before you ruin the upholstery." Catherine didn't move. She watched her father, seeing for the first time the hollow vanity that had always dictated his management of the family firm. "The upholstery will survive, Father," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate in the sudden silence. Richard Morrison didn't smile, but there was a sharp, clinical edge to the way he laid the heavy vellum documents onto the mahogany table. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was like a blade being unsheathed. "Before we discuss the distribution of the remaining 65% of the voting shares," Richard began, his eyes fixing on Isabelle, "we must address the integrity and professionalism clause Aliner inserted into the final codicil only 3 weeks ago." Isabelle's thumb froze on her phone. She looked up, her expression shifting from boredom to a sharp, predatory flicker of concern. "What clause? Grandmother never mentioned any clauses to me." "That's because it was triggered by specific actions," Richard replied. He reached into the folder and pulled out a sleek, silver USB drive. The light from the crystal chandelier caught the metal, sending a jagged spark across the room. Aliner was very clear. Any heir found attempting to circumvent the legal transition or manipulate company records prior to the reading would forfeit their claim to the leadership roles. Mrs. Hartwell gasped, her hand fluttering to the pearls at her throat. "Richard, surely you aren't suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mrs. Hartwell. I am stating facts." Richard turned his gaze to Catherine. "Catherine, would you care to explain why Sarah Chen, the CFO, contacted me this morning regarding the server logs in the accounting department?" Catherine felt the weight of the phone in her own pocket, the recording she'd made only hours ago of Isabelle bragging about fixing the dividend payouts. She didn't reveal it yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch, watching the color begin to drain from Isabelle's perfectly contoured cheeks. "I think Isabelle knows exactly why Sarah is concerned," Catherine said. She took a step forward, the wine-stained hem of her dress trailing on the marble. "She knows about the late-night visit to the archives. She knows about the deleted folders, and I imagine she knows why James Hartwell has been fielding frantic calls about missing inheritance tax documents all afternoon. Isabelle stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. You're lying. You're just jealous because grandmother loved me more. You've always been the boring one, the worker bee. You don't have proof of anything. Actually, Richard interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. Sarah Chen provided me with the security footage and the digital footprint. It seems someone used your personal login, Isabelle, at 2:00 a.m. on Tuesday. The room plunged into a suffocating quiet. Mr. Hartwell looked from one daughter to the other, his face turning a mottled, angry purple. But it wasn't anger at Isabelle's theft. It was the panic of a man seeing his favorite pawn being removed from the board. There must be a mistake, Mr. Hartwell stammered. Isabelle wouldn't. She doesn't even know how to use the accounting software. She didn't need to know how to use it, Catherine said, her eyes locked on her sister's trembling hands. She just needed to be arrogant enough to think no one was watching the person they'd already dismissed. Isabelle's face twisted, the mask of the polished socialite finally cracking to reveal the panicked bully beneath. So what? You think this makes you the boss? You're still just the help, Catherine. You'll always be the one cleaning up the mess. No, Catherine replied, her voice like a closing door. I'm the one who's been keeping this family from falling apart for 10 years, and as of this moment, the conduct audit has officially begun. Richard Morrison nodded, his hand hovering over the final page of the document. The transition is frozen for 48 hours pending a full forensic review. We meet again on Thursday morning at the corporate headquarters. Isabelle, I suggest you retain your own counsel. You're going to need it. Catherine watched as Isabelle's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the floor. The countdown had started. 48 hours until the Hartwell name meant nothing, and the truth meant everything. Catherine turned her back on her family, the cold wine stain on her back no longer feeling like a mark of shame, but a battle scar. She had 2 days to finish what Alina had started, and she wouldn't be doing it alone. 2 days later, the sterile silence of the Hartwell corporate headquarters felt like the breath before a scream. Catherine stepped into the elevator, her reflection in the polished chrome doors unrecognizable from the woman who had been doused in wine 48 hours prior. The charcoal gray suit she wore was stiff, tailored with a precision that felt like armor. She didn't look like a daughter or a sister. She looked like an executioner. The doors slid open on the 14th floor, the heart of the IT and records department. Sarah Chen was already waiting in her glass-walled office, the blue light from 4 different monitors reflecting off her glasses. The room smelled of ozone and the scorched scent of an overtaxed espresso machine. Without a word, Sarah turned a screen toward Catherine. It's worse than we thought, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Isabelle wasn't just skimming. She created a vendor account for a company called Graceful Living. It's a shell, Catherine. Every time you authorized a budget for warehouse maintenance, 30% was diverted. She's been stealing from the employees' pension fund to pay for those sponsored trips to the Maldives. Catherine felt a cold, sharp vibration in her chest that had nothing to do with the secure USB drive Sarah slid across the desk. She picked up the small metal object, its surface chilling her palm. This was the architect's legacy. Alina hadn't just left Catherine a share of the company. She had left her the tools to excise the rot that was killing it. Does anyone else know? Catherine asked. James Hartwell from accounting saw me pulling the logs, Sarah replied, glancing toward the door. He's been keeping his head down, but he told me Isabelle was in the building an hour ago. She was bragging to the administrative staff that the audit was a formality and that your father had already promised to have the whole thing dismissed by the board. Catherine thanked her and headed toward the executive wing. The click of her heels on the marble floor was rhythmic and predatory. As she turned the corner toward the boardroom, she ran straight into the very person she was looking for. Isabelle stood there, draped in a cream-colored silk trench coat that probably cost more than a warehouse manager's annual salary. She was holding a green juice in one hand and her phone in the other, laughing at something on the screen. When she saw Catherine, Her expression shifted from amusement to a look of profound, practiced pity. "Oh, Catherine, you're still doing this," Isabelle sighed, the scent of her cloying, expensive lily perfume filling the hallway. "It's honestly getting a little embarrassing." Mom and Dad are worried you're having some kind of episode. Maybe the stress of being operations director finally cracked that boring little brain of yours. "The audit is moving forward, Isabelle," Catherine said, her voice as flat and immovable as a headstone. Isabelle stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a sudden, ugly heat. "Listen to me, you pathetic mouse. I've already spoken to the board. They think this is a jealous tantrum because I'm the face of the brand and you're just the person who counts the boxes. Dad is going to sign the transition papers tomorrow morning, audit or no audit. You'll be lucky if he doesn't have you committed for the weekend just to keep you from making a scene at the gala." She reached out, flicking a stray hair off Catherine's shoulder with a sneer. "Go home, wash that cheap suit. Maybe if you're quiet, I'll let you keep your little office in the basement." Isabelle didn't wait for a response. She sauntered away, the rhythmic tap of her $2,000 stilettos sounding like a countdown. Catherine didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the private office of Richard Morrison. As she entered, she found her parents already there, sitting on the leather sofa like royalty awaiting a tribute. "Catherine, thank goodness," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice trembling with performative grief. "Please, tell Richard you're dropping this nonsense. It's tearing the family apart. Isabelle has been crying all morning." "She's a sensitive soul, Catherine," Mr. Hartwell added, his face reddening as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. "She isn't built for this kind of scrutiny. You, on the other hand, have always been the sturdy one. Just let it go. We'll increase your salary, give you a nice bonus. Just stop trying to ruin your sister's life." "Is that what you think this is?" Catherine asked, looking at her father. "A negotiation?" "It's a plea for decency," her mother cried. "You're just jealous because she's always been the favorite. We know it, the board knows it. Don't do this." Catherine looked at Richard Morrison, who was standing by the window, his expression unreadable. He held a thick manila envelope. He stepped forward and handed it to Catherine, ignoring the protests of her parents. "The forensic review is complete," Richard said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "And the evidence is undeniable. Catherine, the board meeting is scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. The conduct audit is no longer a suggestion. It is a legal mandate." Catherine felt the weight of the envelope in her hand, the bank records, the shell company filings, the security footage. She looked at her parents, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't protecting a family, they were protecting a lie. "I'll see you both on Thursday," Catherine said. She walked out of the office, leaving her mother's frantic calls behind her. She had 24 hours until the final confrontation. 24 hours until the Hartwell name was stripped of its gold plating. As she reached the lobby, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Sarah Chen. "Leak the meeting time to the press. I want witnesses." The countdown had hit 0. Tomorrow, the world would see exactly what was hidden behind the Hartwell legacy. The Wednesday morning before the board meeting arrived with a deceptive, heavy stillness. Catherine Marie Hartwell sat in the sun-drenched breakfast room of the family estate, the air thick with the scent of oversteeped Earl Grey tea and expensive furniture polish. Across the mahogany table, Isabelle Grace Hartwell was already in high gear, her fingers flying across her phone's screen as she curated her latest lifestyle post. She wore a tailored white silk suit that shimmered under the chandelier, a sharp contrast to Catherine's simple navy dress. The rhythmic clinking of sterling silver against bone china was the only sound until Isabelle looked up, her lip curling in a familiar, practiced sneer. "You're still wearing that same tired watch, Catherine. Honestly, if you're going to show up to the board meeting tomorrow just to watch me take over, you could at least attempt to look like a Hartwell. You look like the help." Catherine didn't flinch. She set her teacup down with a controlled click, her eyes remaining calm. "The audit begins at 10 o'clock sharp, Isabelle. I'm offering you a final olive branch. If you come forward now and admit to the shell company filings in Delaware, I can speak to Richard Morrison. We might be able to settle this as a family matter before the board sees the security footage from the server room. Isabelle let out a sharp, jagged laugh that grated against the quiet of the room. The server room? You're delusional. You've spent too much time in the basement with the accountants. Nobody cares about your little spreadsheets, Catherine. Dad and Mom have already signed off on the restructuring. By noon tomorrow, your 35% will be a footnote in my success story. At that moment, Mr. Hartwell entered the room, adjusting his gold cufflinks with the casual arrogance of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. He didn't even look at his eldest daughter as he leaned down to kiss Isabelle's cheek. "Don't let her get in your head, Izzy," he said, his voice dripping with dismissive boredom. He finally turned his gaze toward Catherine, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You always were the jealous one, Catherine. You think that because you put in the hours, you own the legacy. But vision is what leads a company, not clerical busywork. Tomorrow isn't an audit, it's a coronation. I'd suggest you use today to update your resume." Catherine felt the weight of the encrypted thumb drive in her pocket, a secret power that pulsed against her hip. She looked at her father, seeing the man who had enabled Isabelle's theft for years. "I've tried to protect the name," she said softly, her voice like a thin blade. "But you're right. Vision is important. And I think you'll find that my vision for the Hartwell legacy is much clearer than yours." Mrs. Hartwell drifted into the room, a cloud of expensive French perfume following her. She didn't sit. She merely hovered, looking at Catherine with a pity that felt more insulting than Isabelle's rage. "Dear, don't be difficult. Isabelle is the face of this family. She's the one the public loves. Why can't you just be happy in the background? We've even planned a celebration dinner at the pier for tomorrow night. There's a seat for you at the end of the table if you can manage to be gracious." Isabelle smirked, holding up a heavy, gold-embossed invitation card. The texture was thick and arrogant. "See, we're even letting you come to the party. Just try not to talk about compliance or ethics." It's such a buzzkill. Catherine rose from the table, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply picked up her leather portfolio, the one containing the leaked press schedule Sarah Chen had confirmed just an hour ago. "Enjoy the quiet while it lasts," Catherine said, pausing at the doorway. She looked back at the three of them, the bully, the enabler, and the socialite, all trapped in a bubble of their own making. "Tomorrow, the world is going to see exactly what lies behind the Hartwell name. I hope the pier has a very flexible cancellation policy." She walked out before they could respond, leaving the room silent once more. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed with a text from James Hartwell. "The press gallery is packed. Sarah has the projector ready. They have no idea the locks are already being changed." Catherine gripped the steering wheel, her pulse steady. 14 hours. In 14 hours, the crown they were so eager to wear would become a noose. She drove away from the estate without looking back, the countdown to the board meeting echoing in the quiet hum of the engine. The final warning had been given, and as she expected, it had been laughed away. Tomorrow, the laughter would stop. The evening arrived with a deceptive stillness that draped over the Pierre Hotel like a silk shroud. Catherine stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Inside, the documents were cold and heavy, a physical manifestation of the storm she was about to unleash. She had chosen a charcoal-colored suit, sharp, tailored, and utterly devoid of the flamboyant gold accents that Isabelle favored. Catherine wasn't here to sparkle, she was here to preside. The scent of 1,000 hothouse gardenias hit her the moment the gilded doors swung open. It was an expensive, suffocating fragrance, chosen by Mrs. Hartwell to mask the scent of old money and new desperation. Crystal chandeliers hummed with a low electric thrum, casting jagged light over the assembled board members and their spouses. "You actually showed up," a voice dripped with saccharine poison. Catherine turned to see Isabelle gliding toward her. Her sister was a walking billboard for excess, draped in a shimmering gown that looked like liquid brass. She held a flute of vintage champagne in one hand and her phone in the other, her thumb dancing across the screen as she live-streamed her own entrance. I wouldn't miss the reorganization vote for the world, Catherine said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against her sister's frantic energy. Isabelle let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the attention of a nearby cluster of investors. Reorganization? Is that what we're calling your retirement party now? Honestly, Catherine, that suit is so functional. It's a shame you didn't put in more effort for your final night on the payroll. Isabelle leaned closer, the smell of her cloying, expensive perfume, the kind that cost more per ounce than a month of Catherine's mortgage, filling the space between them. I've already posted the announcement to my followers. Out with the old, in with the gold. The board is just waiting for the formal toast to sign the papers. By midnight, your 35% will be a footnote in the history of my brand. Catherine didn't flinch. She felt the vibration of her phone in her pocket, a single pulse. It was the signal from Sarah Chen. The security feeds were live, and the projector was synced. You should be careful with your captions, Isabelle. Trends change overnight. Isabelle rolled her eyes and turned her back, dismissing her sister with a flick of her wrist. She sashayed toward the head table, where Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell sat like royalty in a crumbling kingdom. Catherine watched her go, her gaze shifting to the far corner of the room. James Hartwell was there, standing near the bar, sipping a club soda. He caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He had spent the last 3 hours in the accounting archives, ensuring the trail of Isabelle's marketing expenses was highlighted in neon red. The room began to settle as the catering staff, moving with rhythmic precision, began serving the first course. The clatter of silver against fine bone china created a percussive backdrop to the murmurs of the elite. Catherine took her seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, positioned intentionally outside the inner circle of the family. Mr. Hartwell stood, his tuxedo straining slightly against his frame. He tapped a crystal spoon against his glass, the sound sharp and demanding. The ballroom fell into a practiced silence. Friends, colleagues, and shareholders, he began, his voice booming with unearned confidence. Tonight marks a pivot point for the Hartwell legacy. For too long, we have been weighed down by traditionalism and, let's be honest, a lack of vision. But my daughter, Isabelle, has shown us the path forward. Her digital expansion strategy is the breath of life this company needs. Mrs. Hartwell beamed, reaching out to squeeze Isabelle's hand. Isabelle looked toward Catherine, her smirk wide and predatory. To that end, Mr. Hartwell continued, ignoring the subtle shadow of Richard Morrison as the lawyer slipped into the seat next to Catherine, we will be moving forward with the internal share redistribution. It is time the leadership reflects the talent. Catherine felt the cool, smooth texture of the portfolio beneath her hand. She glanced at the table's centerpiece, a towering arrangement of white lilies. The scent was funereal. "Wait for it," Richard whispered, his voice so low it was almost lost in the applause. He didn't look at Catherine. His eyes were fixed on the briefcase at his feet, which contained the original, unadulterated will of a leaner Hartwell. Before we proceed to the formal signing, Isabelle interrupted, standing up and smoothing her gown, I'd like to say a few words. After all, it's not every day you get to save a company from its own mediocrity. She turned her gaze directly to Catherine, her eyes gleaming with a cruel, triumphant light. Catherine has been a dedicated employee for years, truly. But some people are meant to be the engine, and some are meant to be the hood ornament. I think we all know who is who. A few of the younger board members chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Catherine's father didn't stop her. He simply smiled, a man who had traded his integrity for a peaceful dinner table long ago. Catherine leaned back, her spine a straight line of cold steel. She could feel the weight of the room shifting, the collective anticipation of a public execution. Isabelle was at her peak, her arrogance radiating off her like heat from a dying star. She reached for the fountain pen sitting on a velvet cushion in front of her father. "Wait," Catherine said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a frequency that cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a blade through silk. The room went still. The servers froze. Isabelle's hand paused an inch above the pen. "Catherine, don't make this more embarrassing than it already is. Mr. Hartwell warned, his brow furrowing. "Sit down." "I'm not standing," Catherine replied, her voice dropping an octave, becoming even more dangerous. She slowly opened the portfolio, the sound of the zipper echoing in the silence. "But before you sign those papers, I believe the board would be interested in the third quarter audit, the one Isabelle forgot to include in her presentation." She looked toward the back of the room, where Sarah Chen stood poised at the lighting console. Catherine's pulse was steady, a rhythmic drumbeat of impending justice. "Isabelle," Catherine said, her eyes locking onto her sister's widening gaze, "did you really think I wouldn't notice where the digital expansion budget was actually going? Or did you just think I was too functional to understand the math?" Isabelle's smirk faltered, a hairline fracture appearing in her golden mask. The countdown had reached 0. The banquet was over, and the trial was about to begin. Catherine raised her hand, a silent signal to Sarah, as the lights in the ballroom began to dim. The blue light of the projector sliced through the dim ballroom, casting long, jagged shadows across the faces of the Hartwell board. Catherine Marie Hartwell stood perfectly still, her silhouette a sharp contrast against the glowing spreadsheet that now dominated the room. The hum of the cooling fan was the only sound, a mechanical heartbeat in the sudden, suffocating silence. "These aren't just numbers, Isabelle," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant chill that carried further than a shout. "This is the IG Media Shell Company. 12 transfers over 18 months, all labeled as digital expansion research. But the routing numbers lead back to a private offshore account registered in your name." Isabelle Grace Hartwell didn't move at first. She sat at the head of the table, her hand still frozen around the stem of a crystal flute. Then, the disintegration began. It started in her eyes, which widened until the whites showed all the way around her pupils, darting frantically from the screen to the silent faces of the board. The practiced porcelain mask she wore for her social media followers seemed to melt, the expensive bronzer on her cheeks turning a sickly ashen gray as the blood drained from her head. Her lower lip developed a violent, uncontrollable tremor, and her mouth hung open in a jagged, silent gasp, her breathing coming in ragged hitches that made her diamond necklace catch the light in frantic, stuttering bursts. She looked suddenly small, her shoulders hunching as if she were trying to physically shrink away from the undeniable truth glowing in black and white behind her. James Hartwell leaned forward, his glasses reflecting the columns of stolen millions. He let out a sharp, disparaging whistle that echoed off the high ceilings. "My God, Isabelle, you didn't even try to hide the trail. You really thought we were all too stupid to look." Across the table, Mr. Hartwell's face shifted from confusion to a deep, bruised purple. He stared at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, his hands trembling so violently that his wedding ring clattered against the wood. Beside him, Mrs. Hartwell let out a soft, strangled sob, her hand flying to her throat to clutch her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. The social standing she had spent 30 years building was evaporating in the cold light of a digital audit. "The third quarter audit was never missing, Sarah," Catherine said, nodding toward Sarah Chen. "It was just waiting for the right moment to be verified." Sarah stepped forward, her face a mask of professional stoicism. "I've already sent the digital copies to the forensic team. Every signature has been authenticated." Isabelle finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing that cracked under the weight of the room's judgment. You set me up. You manipulated the data. Dad, tell her." "Tell her she can't do this." But her father remained silent, his head bowed in a shame that no amount of family loyalty could cover. Catherine walked slowly toward her sister, the sound of her heels on the marble floor like the ticking of a clock reaching midnight. She stopped just inches away, the scent of Isabelle's expensive, cloying perfume clashing with the sterile smell of fresh ink and ozone from the projector. "I didn't have to manipulate anything," Catherine whispered, loud enough for every witness to hear. "I just stopped cleaning up after you. You spent years calling me functional like it was a dirty word, Isabelle. You thought my attention to detail made me a servant to your lifestyle." She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto her sister's tear-streaked face. But functionality means I know exactly where the bodies are buried because I'm the one who keeps the maps. You didn't just fail the company. You failed the legacy Aliner left us. Richard Morrison stepped out from the shadows near the lighting console, holding a leather-bound folder. He didn't look at Isabelle. He looked only at Catherine. The clause is triggered, Catherine. Under the terms of the primary trust, any board member found engaging in the misappropriation of corporate funds forfeits their voting rights and their equity effective immediately. The room seemed to tilt. Isabelle's glass finally slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor. The champagne soaked into the hem of her designer gown, a cold, sparkling ruin. "You're not a shareholder anymore, Isabelle," Catherine said, her voice devoid of heat or malice. It was simply a fact. "And you're certainly not my sister. You're just a liability we're finally writing off." Catherine turned to Richard, her movements fluid and decisive. "Richard, please ensure security escorts her to her room to pack her personal belongings. She's to be off the property by dawn. Sarah, I want the full board in the conference room in 10 minutes. We have a lot of damage to undo." Without a backward glance at the sobbing woman at the head of the table, Catherine walked toward the exit. She felt the weight of the portfolio in her hand, the evidence that had been her shield and her sword. The banquet was over, but for the first time in a decade, the air in the Hartwell estate felt clean. She stepped out into the hallway, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her, muffling the sound of her sister's frantic, useless excuses. Catherine didn't stop. She had a company to run, and the sunrise was only a few hours away. 10 minutes later, the grand foyer of the Hartwell estate resembled a crime scene rather than the entrance to a dynasty. Catherine Marie Hartwell stood at the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase, her silhouette sharp against the clinical white marble. The storm outside had finally broken, and the scent of ozone and wet pavement drifted through the open front doors, mingling with the heavy, cloying fragrance of the lilies Isabelle had insisted on for the banquet. "You can't do this." Isabelle Grace Hartwell shrieked, her voice cracking as it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She was clutching a gilded console table as if it were a life raft, her designer gown torn at the hem. "Dad, tell her she can't do this. It's my house, too." Mr. Hartwell stepped forward, his face a map of indecision and habitual weakness. He looked at Catherine, his eyes pleading for the status quo. "Catherine, surely we can discuss this in the morning. It's late, and the optics of having security escort your sister out in the middle of the night." The optics were decided when Isabelle tried to drain the operating accounts to cover her personal credit card debt, Catherine interrupted, her voice as level as a horizon line. She didn't raise her volume, but the authority in her tone caused the two security guards to shift closer to the door. "Richard, the documents." Richard Morrison stepped out from the shadows of the library, flanked by Sarah Chen. He held a sleek black tablet, its screen glowing with a cold blue light that seemed to leach the warmth from the room. "The board has already reviewed the digital signatures, Isabelle. They've been verified as forgeries. Under the terms of the revised will, any attempt to defraud the estate results in immediate forfeiture of residency rights." Isabelle's face began to undergo a terrifying transformation. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving them a sallow, sickly gray that made her expensive foundation look like a cracked porcelain mask. Her eyes, usually wide with performative innocence, darted frantically from the tablet to the stony faces of the board members gathered near the door. Her lower lip trembled so violently she had to bite it to keep from sobbing, but her jaw remained slack, her breath coming in ragged, audible hitches that rattled in her chest. The arrogance that had been her armor for 24 years didn't just crack. It disintegrated, leaving behind a hollow, desperate girl who realized the world no longer owed her a living. "Sarah," Isabelle gasped, turning toward the CFO. "We're friends, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake, a clerical error." Sarah Chen didn't blink. She adjusted her glasses, her expression one of professional disdain. "I watched the footage of you entering my office at 2:00 a.m., Isabelle. You didn't even bother to wear gloves when you touched my keyboard. I've spent 3 years cleaning up your clerical errors. I'm finished." James Hartwell, standing by the coat rack, checked his watch and shook his head. The transfer of power is already live on the internal server, Catherine. Every employee in the building knows the locks are changing. The locks, Mrs. Hartwell whispered, her hand fluttering to her throat. Catherine, she's your blood. You're making her a vagabond. I'm making her accountable, Catherine replied. She reached into the portfolio and pulled out a single, heavy brass key, the old master key to the front door. She walked over to a small silver bowl on the entry table and dropped it. The metallic asterisk clang was final, a funeral knell for the old regime. The digital codes were updated 5 minutes ago. Your biometric access has been purged from the system, Isabelle. This house doesn't recognize your face anymore. Isabelle lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the air as if she could grab the authority Catherine had just stripped away. I'll sue you. I'll tell everyone what a cold-hearted bitch you are. You think you've won? You're just a glorified accountant in a cheap suit. Catherine didn't flinch. She watched as the 2 security guards stepped in, firmly but politely taking Isabelle by the elbows. The witnesses, the board, the lawyer, the cousin who had seen too much, all stepped back, creating a physical gap between the heir and the exile. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a decade's worth of resentment finally being balanced. You always told me I didn't belong in this family because I worked for what I had, Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than Isabelle's screams. You were right. I don't belong in your version of this family. I'm building a new one. She turned her back on the sobbing woman and the stunned parents, her heels clicking a rhythmic, steady beat against the marble as she headed toward the conference room. She didn't look back when she heard the heavy front doors groan shut, or when the sound of a luxury car's engine faded into the distance. Inside the conference room, the air was still and smelled of old paper and fresh ink. Catherine sat at the head of the long table, the seat Isabelle had occupied only hours before. She opened the portfolio one last time, looking at the final page. There was one more name on the list of people who had helped Isabelle hide the money, a name she hadn't revealed to the board yet. She traced the signature with her thumb, a cold smile touching her lips. The night was far from over, and the list of people who thought they were untouchable was about to get much shorter. Catherine pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. It's done, she said when the line picked up. Start the audit on the offshore accounts. I want to know exactly how much my father knew. 6 months had passed since the night the Hartwell boardroom became a courtroom of Catherine's own making. The seasons had shifted from a biting winter to a humid, restless summer, and the landscape of the family empire had been permanently reshaped. Catherine Marie Hartwell sat in the high-backed leather chair that had once belonged to her grandfather, the only man in the family who had truly understood the weight of the name. The office smelled of expensive sandalwood and the crisp, ozone scent of a high-end air purifier. It was a sterile, powerful atmosphere, devoid of the floral perfumes and chaos that used to define the space. A soft knock preceded the entrance of Richard Morrison. He carried a single, slim folder, a stark contrast to the mountains of evidence they had wielded half a year ago. He placed it on the mahogany desk with a nod of professional respect. The final divestment is complete, he said, his voice level. The offshore accounts have been drained and the funds redistributed to the operations budget as you directed. Your father's pension has been capped at the standard executive minimum. He signed the papers this morning. Catherine didn't open the folder immediately. She traced the edge of a heavy glass paperweight, feeling its cold, sharp corners against her palm. Did he say anything? He asked if you were coming to Sunday dinner, Richard replied. Your mother has been calling the office again. She's insistent that the family needs to heal before the charity gala. A flicker of the old rage sparked in her chest. Healing, in her mother's vocabulary, was simply a synonym for forgetting. Mrs. Hartwell wanted the public image of the unified Hartwell family restored, regardless of the rot that had nearly destroyed them. She wanted Catherine to play the role of the dutiful daughter, while Isabelle was quietly brought back into the fold. Sunday dinner is for families who haven't spent a decade trying to cannibalize each other, she said coldly. Tell Sarah Chen to increase the security detail for the gala. I don't want any unauthorized family members gaining access to the VIP floor. Later that afternoon, Catherine found herself driven through a part of the city she rarely frequented. She had James Hartwell to thank for the tip. Her cousin had remained a quiet, loyal informant, and he'd sent a text earlier that morning with an address and a brief message. Thought you'd want to see what accountability looks like. The car slowed as it passed a row of aging brick buildings. The air here was heavy with the smell of hot asphalt and the humid, cloying scent of a nearby industrial laundry. Catherine looked out the tinted window and saw her. Isabelle Grace Hartwell was standing on a cracked sidewalk, clutching a paper bag that looked dangerously close to tearing. The designer silks were gone, replaced by a stiff polyester uniform from a high-end boutique 3 blocks away, a shop where she now worked the floor she used to haunt as a customer. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed by a team of stylists, was pulled back in a messy, utilitarian knot. As Catherine watched, a bus pulled up to the curb, shrieking as its air brakes engaged. A cloud of gray exhaust billowed over the sidewalk, coating the younger woman in a fine layer of grit. She didn't scream or throw a tantrum. She simply closed her eyes and waited for the cloud to pass, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that looked permanent. The face slap of the public reveal had been a momentary explosion, but this, the slow, grinding reality of a life unearned, was the true consequence. Isabelle had spent years mocking those she deemed below her. Now she was the one counting coins for the bus fare while the world she thought she owned moved on without her. Catherine felt a hollow sort of satisfaction. It wasn't the fiery triumph she had imagined during those long nights of evidence gathering. It was colder, heavier. She realized then that justice wasn't just about taking back what was hers. It was about the silence that followed. Returning to the manor that evening, the silence was deafening. The house was hers now, but it felt like a museum. She walked past the parlor where her parents used to hold court, the room now draped in dust covers. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a voicemail from her mother. "Catherine, darling, please." The voice was thin, stripped of its usual social authority. "Your father isn't sleeping. Isabelle is. She's struggling, Catherine. She's your sister. How can you be so heartless? We're your family." She didn't listen to the rest. She deleted the message and set the phone face down on the cold marble of the foyer table. She had won the war, saved the company, and secured her legacy. But as she looked at the darkened hallway, she acknowledged the cost. She had traded the warmth of a lie for the freezing clarity of the truth. She walked to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens. The Hartwell name was safe, and the lion was no longer sleeping. But the den was very, very quiet. Catherine closed the heavy velvet curtains, shutting out the night, and walked into the shadows of her victory.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.